The stage of questions, the hall was filled with a soft hum of whispers, a restless sound that carried across rows of diplomats, journalists, scholars, and leaders from every corner of the globe. It was a hall built for ceremony. Tall ceilings, painted in muted colors, the faint gleam of chandeliers above, and the stern portraits of past statesmen watching from the walls. Outside, the city was alive with flashing cameras and hurried footsteps, but inside, a silence pressed down like a weight. Everyone knew that the next words spoken would not just be another debate or another panel. They would echo far beyond these walls. The moderator had introduced the speakers with polite formality, yet there was a tension in his voice as he gestured toward Tulsi Gabbard. She rose slowly, her expression calm but firm, her eyes scanning the hall as though she carried not only her own question but the voice of millions who wondered the same. Her presence was magnetic, commanding without force, and when she began to speak, every shuffle of paper and every cough in the room fell away into stillness. Her words were not coated with courtesy. They cut straight to the heart. She asked about India's future. She spoke of corruption, of inequality, of broken promises that had lingered for decades. She asked if the dream of a rising India was only an illusion, a story told to comfort, but never fulfilled. She questioned whether leaders, even the most admired, had the courage to admit what was broken. She did not mention Sundar Pichai directly, at first, but her words leaned toward him, and soon her gaze followed. The cameras turned, lenses pointed toward Sundar, catching his quiet frame seated in the middle of the stage. He was not dressed like the politicians beside him, nor like the military officers who bore medals on their jackets. His attire was simple, his posture calm, and his expression thoughtful, almost too still, as though he had known this moment would come. He did not immediately rise. Instead, he looked down for a moment, his fingers touching the edge of the chair, his mind traveling far away from the glittering stage. For Sundar, this question was not only about India's politics or its economy. It was about his own journey, his own memories, the struggles of a boy who had once grown up in the crowded streets of Chennai. He remembered his father's tired face after long hours at work. His father was an electrical engineer, practical, disciplined, and modest in every choice he made. Sundar remembered the day his father brought home a radio, not new, not shiny, but second-hand. That small object became a universe for the boy. He would turn the knob slowly, listening to the crackle, to the sudden burst of music, to the voices traveling across invisible waves. It was magic, and it was also a lesson. Technology could be a bridge, even for a boy who lived in a small, two-room apartment. His mother's presence was different, gentle yet firm in values. She taught him that respect was not a choice you gave only to those above you, but something you offered to everyone, especially those who had nothing to give in return. Humility was not a weakness, she said, but a way of seeing the world clearly. Those lessons, whispered in quiet kitchens and on narrow balconies, became the foundation he carried into every room, including this one now filled with powerful eyes waiting for his answer. But Sundar also remembered the struggles, the heat of Chennai's summers, when the electricity failed and the ceiling fan stood still, leaving the family to wait through long nights in silence. He remembered the crowded buses he took to school, sometimes pressed so tightly between bodies that he could barely breathe, holding his books close to protect them. He remembered studying by dim light, not knowing if any of it would lead to something greater. And yet, through it all, there was resilience. There was always the small voice that told him tomorrow could be better if he kept walking forward. In the hall, Tulsi's words lingered. Some nodded in agreement, others frowned, but all waited. Sundar finally rose, his steps slow but steady. He adjusted his glasses, and for a brief second, he did not look like the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the world. He looked like that boy from Chennai again, small in frame, uncertain in the eyes of strangers, yet carrying something unshakable inside. He stood behind the podium, the lights glaring down, the microphones waiting. His voice, when it came, was soft, almost too soft for such a large room. But there was something in it that made people lean closer, as though the quietness itself carried weight. He began not with statistics, not with defenses, not with polished speeches. He began with memory. He spoke of his childhood, of the first time he touched a computer, the way it felt like touching the future. He spoke of how his father sacrificed much to give him that chance, how his mother's quiet wisdom guided him. He described moments of doubt, the times when opportunity felt too far away, and the world seemed too heavy for one boy to carry. He spoke of resilience, of humility, of respect. The hall listened, some with admiration, some with doubt, but none with indifference. Sundar's words painted a picture not of politics but of humanity, of small details that shaped a larger destiny. But as he paused, his eyes lifted and locked on Tulsi. The softness in his tone shifted. There was still humility, but also a firmness, rising like steel hidden beneath silk. The audience sensed it. He was about to say something different, something no one expected from a man known for his quiet manner. He leaned slightly forward, his hand gripping the podium just enough for the cameras to catch. He looked across the hall and then back to Tulsi, and he said slowly, almost deliberately, "The future of India cannot be measured only in numbers or policies. It is measured in something else." He stopped. The silence that followed was sharp, almost painful, as though every ear in the hall strained for the next word. Sundar's eyes glimmered, not with pride, but with something deeper, something closer to vulnerability. And then he drew in a breath, preparing to reveal what he truly believed, something that would not just answer the question but challenge everyone in the room. The hall waited, hearts tightened, breaths held. Sundar was about to speak words that could either inspire or unsettle, words that would echo across the world. The echo of childhood. The silence in the hall was thick, almost alive. Sundar Pichai's pause hung in the air like a weight. No one could escape. It was as if time itself leaned forward, demanding his next words. People in the audience shifted in their chairs, but no one dared speak. Even Tulsi Gabbard, who had delivered her question with such force, found herself waiting, caught by the stillness he had created. Then, Sundar's voice returned, calm yet sharpened by emotion. "India's future," he said, his words slow and deliberate, "cannot only be seen through politics or economics. It must be seen through the struggles of its people, through the quiet sacrifices that often go unnoticed." He did not turn to statistics or prepared lines. Instead, he began to share a story, not from boardrooms or summits, but from his own childhood, and in that moment the grand stage dissolved into something intimate. He described how his family lived in a modest home in Chennai, where every inch of space carried meaning. There was no luxury, only necessity, and even necessities were sometimes out of reach. He painted the picture of evenings when the power would vanish, leaving the rooms in darkness, and the family would gather in silence around a small kerosene lamp. He remembered how, during those nights, his father would still try to explain the workings of circuits and wires, drawing sketches on scraps of paper, his face lit faintly by the flame. It was not only knowledge his father gave him in those moments, but a sense of perseverance, the belief that even in the dark, one could create light. Sundar told the audience about the day he first held a rotary phone, a device so basic to others, yet to him it was like touching the future. He remembered how his fingers trembled as he turned the dial, each number clicking into place with mechanical certainty. It was not just a phone. It was a doorway. It was proof that connection was possible, even across great distances. He spoke of how he wondered about the voices traveling across invisible lines, about the engineers who had made it possible, and about the dream that someday he too could create something that connected people. But he did not stop with the warmth of those memories. He also described the ache of rejection, the sting of being overlooked. He told of times at school when his accent, his modest clothes, and his quiet nature set him apart. Some laughed at him for speaking too softly, for not carrying the boldness expected in classrooms. Yet he learned to let silence work in his favor, to observe more, to listen deeply, to wait before speaking. That patience, he said, later became his greatest strength. The audience leaned closer as Sundar's voice carried them into another chapter of his life in his journey to America. He recounted the moment he boarded a plane for the first time, leaving behind everything familiar. He described the strangeness of stepping into a world where he felt invisible, where his accent drew puzzled stares, where he carried little money, and even less confidence. He remembered walking into stores and calculating in his head whether he could afford a single sandwich, choosing sometimes to go hungry so he could save for the future. Loneliness, he admitted, was his constant companion in those early days. He would walk across campus, books clutched against his chest, watching others laugh in groups, feeling the sharp pang of being an outsider. He spoke of nights when he lay, awake in small dorm rooms staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had made a mistake by leaving home. He confessed to moments when the dream of success seemed too far, when the thought of giving up tempted him. But each time he reminded himself of his father's face, of his mother's quiet strength, and of the countless people back home who carried hope despite hardship. Then came the story that startled the hall, a memory from his time at Google, long before he became CEO. He described how he once led a project that failed. It was not a small mistake. It was the kind that could end a career. He remembered walking out of a meeting where his idea had been rejected, where his work was dismissed as impractical. The humiliation clung to him, and for weeks he felt as though he had no place in the company. He thought about leaving, about returning to India quietly, unseen. As he shared this, whispers ran through the audience. Some looked surprised, others skeptical, as if they had never imagined someone like him could stumble so deeply. Sundar noticed their faces, but he did not shy away. Instead, he leaned into the vulnerability, his voice steady but low. Failure, he said, is not the opposite of progress. It is part of it. When you fail, you feel the weight of doubt, but you also discover the strength you did not know you had. And in those moments, kindness matters most. The kindness of others and the kindness you must show yourself. His words carried across the hall like a quiet storm, shaking not with force but with truth. Still, doubt lingered in the air. Some in the audience leaned toward each other, whispering. Was this enough to answer Tulsi's question? Could personal stories about radios, phones, hunger, and failure truly address the larger question of India's future? The tension grew when Tulsi herself shifted forward. Her eyes held sharp focus, her expression unreadable. Sundar's words had moved many, but she was not ready to let him rest there. Before he could continue, she interrupted with a calm but firm voice. These are powerful stories, she said. But they are your stories. What about the millions in India who may never see the chances you had? What about corruption, inequality, broken promises? Do these memories explain how India will overcome those challenges, or are they only personal lessons? The hall turned to Sundar again. Her question cut deeper, more pointed than before. The warmth he had built suddenly collided with the cold edge of reality. For a moment, Sundar stood in silence. He adjusted his glasses again, his eyes lowering, and the audience sensed he was carrying something heavy, something he had not planned to share. His fingers tapped lightly against the podium and his breath slowed. Then, almost unexpectedly, Sundar began to speak of something far more personal, something he had rarely spoken aloud. He told of betrayal, of a time when someone close to him had doubted his worth and used his silence against him. He described how the wound of that betrayal left him questioning not only his work, but his own value as a person. His voice grew softer, yet sharper with each word. He admitted that anger consumed him, that fear kept him awake at night, and that for a time he wanted to walk away from everything. And then, with a quiet intensity, he said, I once thought of leaving Google forever. The words rippled across the hall. Some gasped softly, others froze, but everyone felt the weight of his confession. He looked down at the podium, his hand gripping it more tightly now. The audience leaned forward, desperate to know what had kept him from walking away, what had turned him back toward the path that led him here. Sundar lifted his eyes, and they were glimmering not with triumph, but with something rawer, more human. There was a letter, he whispered, almost as if speaking to himself. A letter I wrote in those darkest days, I never showed it to anyone." He stopped. The hall went still again, the tension rising higher than before. The image of that hidden letter hovered in every mind. What words had he written in his lowest moment? What truths did that paper carry? And as Sundar's silence stretched, the audience knew he was holding something back, something that could either inspire them beyond measure or break the fragile calm he had built. The fire of doubt, the hall remained suspended in silence as if the very air refused to move. Sundar Pichai had spoken of a letter written in his darkest days, a letter never shown to another soul. The audience felt the weight of those words pressing on them. Every eye was fixed on him, every heartbeat echoing in the pause he allowed to stretch between sentences. Tulsi Gabbard leaned slightly forward, her posture calm, but her gaze sharp. She was not moved by sentiment alone. She had seen too many leaders hide behind polished stories, too many promises wrapped in emotion but thin in substance. Her voice, when it came, was steady, each word cutting with precision. "You speak of resilience, Sundar," she said, "and you speak of humility. But the question remains, does India, a nation of more than 1 billion, have the resilience to overcome corruption, inequality, and the deep mistrust in its systems? Does your personal struggle truly answer that? Or does it only tell us that you, one man, survived? What of the millions who cannot?" Her words lingered, heavy and unyielding. Some in the audience nodded in agreement. Others shifted uneasily. Sundar, standing at the podium, did not answer immediately. His silence was not the silence of retreat, but of reflection. His fingers tapped the wood once, twice, then stilled, inhaled slowly and lifted his gaze. His eyes held no defensiveness, no attempt to argue with force. Instead, they carried something deeper, something that made the hall lean closer without realizing. When he spoke, his voice was soft again, but there was an undercurrent of fire, a quiet intensity that gave the words unusual weight. "I understand your doubt," he began, "and you are right to ask. I cannot pretend that my story alone is the story of India. It is not. But in my story there is a mirror of what millions face: rejection, hardship, fear, and betrayal. These are not mine alone. They are the threads that run through the lives of countless people in India and across the world." He paused, and the stillness grew thicker. Then he did something no one expected. He chose to speak about betrayal, not in vague terms, but through a memory that had scarred him deeply. Sundar described a time early in his leadership when someone close to him, someone he had trusted with confidence and hope, turned against him. It was not a public scandal, not a story written in headlines, but it was personal, and for him, devastating. The betrayal came quietly, in the form of words whispered behind closed doors, of doubts planted into the minds of others, of kindness twisted into weakness. He remembered the sting of realizing that someone he believed in had questioned his ability, not to his face, but to those who had the power to end his career. His voice lowered as he told the hall of the nights that followed, how he lay awake, staring at ceilings in unfamiliar hotel rooms haunted by words he could not erase, how fear gripped him, the fear that he was not strong enough, that the whispering voices were right, that his silence made him invisible. He confessed to the loneliness of those nights, to the anger that burned inside him, threatening to consume his humility, threatening to make him someone he did not want to become. "Anger," Sundar said, "is a fire that burns first within yourself. It destroys your clarity, your patience, your kindness. And in those days I felt that fire raging. I thought of leaving. I thought of walking away, not only from Google but from everything I had built. I asked myself if I had been foolish to dream at all." The hall listened with rapt attention, the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the world, standing before them, admitting that he had nearly given up, that he had once been close to surrender. It was a revelation that made him human, vulnerable, and in that vulnerability, powerful. Then came the moment that unsettled the room further. Sundar leaned slightly forward, his eyes glimmering with something raw, and he said, "In those nights I wrote a letter not to anyone else but to myself. I poured into it everything I could not say aloud. My doubts, my anger, my fear, and also the faintest hope that somewhere in all this struggle there was meaning. I never showed it to anyone. Until now. A wave of whispers rippled through the hall. Tulsi's eyes narrowed slightly, as though she was both skeptical and curious. Would he truly reveal something so personal? Sundar reached into the pocket of his jacket, and for a moment the cameras caught the slight tremor in his hand. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges as though it had been touched and unfolded many times over the years. "This letter," he said softly, "was written at a time when I was ready to quit, ready to vanish quietly without notice. And yet, writing these words became the reason I stayed." He unfolded it slowly, the paper crackling under the microphones. The hall was so silent that every sound seemed magnified. The creak of a chair, the faint buzz of the lights above, the soft rustle as Sundar's fingers smoothed the letter. His eyes scanned the page, and for a moment he seemed far away, as though transported back to that night of despair. He drew in a breath and then began to read aloud. "I wrote," Sundar said, his voice steady but quiet. "You are tired. You are unseen. You are doubted. But you must remember, you did not begin this journey for applause. You began because you believed that technology could connect people, that it could lift voices, that it could give power to those who felt powerless. If you leave now, those voices lose a chance. If you stay, you may fail again, but you may also create something greater than yourself." The hall was breathless. The words were not grand or poetic. They were simple, raw, stripped of polish. Yet they carried a power that statistics could not. Sundar lowered the paper but did not fold it back. His hand rested on it, his eyes searching the audience as though he was asking them not just to hear but to feel the truth of it. "This letter," he said, "reminded me that resilience is not about never falling. It is about choosing again and again to rise. And India, with all its wounds, all its scars, has that same choice before it." But Tulsi did not let the moment pass without challenge. She leaned into the microphone, her voice calm but carrying an edge. "A personal letter may save one man," she said, "but does it save a nation? Can a billion people rise together when so many are left behind?" Her words struck like a spark in dry wood. The hall stirred again, tension climbing. Sundar did not answer immediately. He folded the letter carefully, his hand lingering on it as if it were both a wound and a shield. His eyes rose slowly to meet Tulsi's, and for the first time in the evening there was something sharper in his gaze. Not anger, not defiance, but a fire lit by doubt turned into resolve. "Perhaps," Sundar said softly, "the real question is not whether India can rise. The real question is whether we are willing to believe in the strength of its people, the way I had to learn to believe in myself again." The words hung in the air, powerful but incomplete, as though leading towards something greater. And then, almost in a whisper, Sundar added, "But there is something else in that letter I did not read, something I have never said aloud. And perhaps it is time." The hall froze. Tulsi's expression tightened, the audience leaned in, and the silence returned, heavier than before. The rise of resilience, the folded letter rested in Sundar's hand like a fragile relic, its creased edges carrying the weight of 1,000 unsaid thoughts. The hall was frozen, waiting. The cameras zoomed in, the lights grew hotter, and every heartbeat in the audience seemed to synchronize with his silence. Sundar lifted his gaze, his eyes calm, yet shadowed by something unspoken. And for a moment, even Tulsi Gabbard did not move. Finally, Sundar unfolded the letter once more. The paper trembled slightly in his grip, not from weakness but from the gravity of revisiting words that had once belonged only to his private despair. His voice, when it came, was not rehearsed. It was raw, carrying the cadence of a man speaking, to himself rather than to the world. There was another line, he said, his eyes scanning the worn ink. "I wrote, 'You may feel invisible, but invisibility is not emptiness. Sometimes the unseen are the ones who build the foundations others stand upon. If you walk away, the invisible remain unheard. If you stay, Perhaps your silence can become strength. A hush fell deeper over the hall. The audience was not only listening, they were holding their breath, caught in the intimacy of words never meant to be read aloud. Sundar let the silence stretch again before folding the paper and placing it carefully on the podium, as if returning it to its resting place after years of secrecy. Then he straightened, his posture taller, his tone shifting from confession to reflection. When I wrote those words, he continued, I realized resilience is not only about enduring pain. It is about transforming it, about taking the moments that try to break you and using them as stones to build something stronger. Resilience is not an individual trait. It is a collective power. It is the very force that has carried India through centuries of struggle. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the hall. Think of the millions who rise every day despite scarcity. Think of the children who study by candlelight because the electricity has failed again, yet they still dream. Think of the farmers who battle the soil season after season even when the rains betray them. Think of the mothers who cook meals out of almost nothing, but still feed their families with dignity. That is resilience. It is not written in policy, papers. It is lived in daily life. As Sundar spoke, his voice gained strength. He was no longer the quiet man who hesitated at the podium. He was a storyteller, a witness, and his words carried a rhythm that wrapped around the audience like a tide pulling them in. Yet Tulsi did not yield. She leaned forward, her tone steady, her eyes fixed on him. Resilience can keep people alive, she said. But can it change a nation? Survival is not transformation. Endurance is not progress. India's challenges are not only about withstanding hardship. They are about overcoming corruption, rebuilding trust, creating fairness. Can resilience alone achieve that? Her question was sharp, and it pierced through the warmth Sundar's words had built. The audience shifted again, murmurs flickering like sparks in dry air. Sundar took a breath, his eyes narrowing slightly as he weighed his reply. He did not answer her directly. Instead, he turned inward again and began to tell another story. He spoke of his early days at Google when he was given the responsibility to lead a small project that many doubted. It was a simple browser idea, overlooked, dismissed by some as unnecessary. Sundar remembered the skepticism, the dismissive smiles, the whispers that he was not strong enough to lead something meaningful. He told the hall of late nights spent staring at lines of code, of meetings where his voice was drowned out, of moments when failure felt inevitable. I was mocked for my accent, he admitted softly, dismissed for my quiet manner. Some believed leadership required volume. But I learned something important. Leadership requires resilience. It requires the patience to keep showing up even when others doubt you. It requires humility, because arrogance collapses at the first sign of failure. And it requires respect for those who work beside you, for those who disagree with you, even for those who oppose you. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The browser we built eventually became Chrome. It grew beyond expectations, not because I was louder than others, but because I was willing to keep rising after each dismissal, to keep believing in something others could not. Yet see, that is resilience, the refusal to let doubt define you. The hall stirred again, this time not with whispers of doubt, but with murmurs of recognition. Even those who had doubted whether his personal story mattered began to see the thread, that resilience, when practiced not only by one but by millions, could indeed shape the destiny of a nation. Then Sundar shifted once more, and his voice softened. He spoke of his mother, of her quiet lessons delivered in kitchens and courtyards. She told me that respect is not earned by power. It is given freely to everyone, especially to those who have nothing to give in return. She told me that humility is not weakness. It is the ability to see the humanity in others, even when you are in pain yourself. His voice wavered slightly as he said this, the memory of her words wrapping around him like a gentle hand. The hall grew silent again, caught in the tenderness of the moment. Sundar's humility was not performance, it was lived truth, and the audience could feel it. But then, unexpectedly, he leaned forward, his eyes locking on Tulsi with an intensity that startled even her. For the first time, he turned the question back on her. "You asked me if resilience is enough," Sundar said softly. "Let me ask you this. What is leadership without kindness? What is power without humility? What is progress without respect?" The hall erupted with murmurs. Some gasped, others leaned forward, and even Tulsi herself shifted back slightly, caught off guard by the turn. Sundar's question was not asked with aggression, but with a quiet force that made it impossible to dismiss. The silence that followed was electric. Tulsi hesitated, her lips parting as if to reply, but the words did not come immediately. The audience sensed the balance had shifted. Sundar had moved from defense to challenge, and the air was thick with anticipation of what would follow. Through a bond of kindness, the air in the hall trembled with Sundar's question, his words lingering like echoes that refused to fade. What is leadership without kindness? What is power without humility? What is progress without respect? The silence that followed was not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of confrontation, of a truth that pressed too heavily to be ignored. Tulsi Gabbard leaned back in her chair, her lips pressed together in thought. Her eyes searched Sundar's face, not with hostility but with a measured intensity. She had asked the questions that demanded accountability, and now the question had been turned toward her. The audience waited, their eyes darting between the two figures on the stage, sensing that the tension had shifted into something deeper, something no script could have prepared for. After a long moment, Tulsi leaned toward the microphone. Her voice, though calm, carried a faint hesitation. "Kindness," she said slowly, "is often spoken of as if it were enough. But in politics, in governance, in the harshness of the real world, kindness can be seen as weakness. People demand strength, decisiveness, the will to act even when it hurts. So tell me, Sundar, do you truly believe kindness can guide the future of a nation? Or is it only a comfort in personal stories?" A murmur ran through the audience. The question was sharp, but it carried sincerity rather than malice. Tulsi was not mocking him. She was asking him to prove that kindness was more than sentiment. Sundar's gaze softened, his features calm, though his eyes glimmered with something deeply personal. He leaned closer to the podium, his fingers resting gently on the folded letter beside him as though it anchored him to the truth he was about to share. "I believe," he began, his voice steady but low, "that kindness is not weakness. It is courage. It is the ability to see another person's pain and choose not to turn away. It is the power to listen when it is easier to silence, to respect when it is easier to dismiss, to forgive when it is easier to condemn. And I have seen, in my life, in my work, that kindness has more power to change the world than force ever will." He let his words hang, and then he told a story, one that reached into the most fragile part of his past. He spoke of his first months in America, when he was a foreign student in a new country, carrying little money, unfamiliar with the culture, struggling to find belonging. He recalled walking into a small grocery store late one night, counting coins carefully in his palm, realizing he did not have enough to buy even a loaf of bread. He had placed the bread back on the shelf, embarrassed, ready to leave hungry. But the cashier, an older woman with tired eyes, had noticed. Without a word, she rang up the bread, slipped it into a bag, and smiled gently. When Sundar stammered that he did not have enough, she whispered, "Don't worry, you'll figure it out." His voice grew softer as he said, "I never saw her again. She never knew that years later the boy she helped would stand on this stage. But her kindness sustained me in a moment when I could have broken. It reminded me that humanity is not measured in grand gestures but in small acts of grace that ripple far beyond what we can see." The hall was still, many faces softened by the quiet power of the story. Sundar continued, his tone carrying the audience deeper into his memories. He told them of his early days at Google when he was still unknown, sitting in long meetings where his ideas were overlooked. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, he had stayed late in the office, quietly working on code. A colleague, someone he barely knew, stopped by, left a cup of coffee on his desk, and simply said, "Keep going." I believe in this. It was a small act, but Sundar carried it like a lantern in the dark. Years later, when Chrome became a success, he sought out that same colleague, not to boast but to say thank you. Kindness, Sundar said, is the thread that connects our struggles. It is the invisible bridge that allows us to carry one another forward. Without it, resilience becomes cold and progress becomes hollow. Then his tone shifted and he spoke of something heavier. He recalled a moment inside Google when disaster loomed. A project teetering on the edge of collapse, the company's future uncertain, and his leadership questioned. Anger filled the rooms, divisions widened, and fear spread. In that chaos, what saved them was not arrogance or force but a series of small kindnesses. Engineers who stayed late to support one another, managers who encouraged their teams instead of blaming them, colleagues who reminded each other of why they had started in the first place. In those days, Sundar said, kindness was not a luxury. It was survival. It was the only reason we made it through. And because we did, millions of people today use tools that connect them, educate them, and empower them. Kindness built that future. His words rolled through the hall like a tide. The weight of his conviction was undeniable. But Tulsi was not finished. She leaned into her microphone once more, her eyes searching him. And India? She asked. Do you believe kindness can heal India's wounds? Can it lift a nation still scarred by inequality, still fractured by division? Or is this only an ideal, too fragile for the real world? The question hung like a challenge, sharp, yet sincere. Sundar did not flinch. He drew in a slow breath, his hand pressing gently on the podium. And then he spoke with a tone that seemed to rise not only from his own life, but from the millions whose stories he carried within him. Yes, he said simply. I believe it. Can. Because I have seen it. I have seen kindness in the poorest villages where families share what little they have with strangers. I have seen kindness in classrooms where teachers work without pay because they believe their students deserve a chance. I have seen kindness in the streets, in the markets, in the hospitals, in the resilience of ordinary people who keep choosing humanity over hate. And if kindness can live there in the hardest places, then it can live anywhere. It can heal. It can unite. It can guide a nation. The hall was silent, not out of doubt this time, but out of awe. Even those who had entered the room skeptical now felt the quiet force of his words pressing into their hearts. And then Sundar did something that no one expected. He leaned forward, his eyes locking on Tulsi's, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of both question and invitation. You asked me about India's future, he said. Now I ask you, and every leader in this room, will you dare to lead with kindness? Will you dare to build not only with power, but with respect, humility, and grace? Because that is the future I believe in. The hall erupted in murmurs, some gasping, some nodding, some caught in visible reflection. Tulsi herself froze for a moment, her expression unguarded, as if the challenge had pierced deeper than she expected. Sundar's voice fell to a whisper as he added, The future will not be built by fear. It will be built by kindness. The silence that followed was electric. The audience leaned in, hearts pounding, waiting to see how Tulsi would respond, how the hall would react, what would come next. The final reply that shocked the world. Hall was silent, its atmosphere trembling with the weight of Sundar Pichai's last words. Tulsi Gabbard's lips parted as if to answer, but for the first time that evening, she hesitated. Her eyes searched Sundar's face, and for a moment, it seemed as though the sharpness in her gaze softened into reflection. The audience, restless yet frozen, leaned forward, sensing that the moment had shifted beyond confrontation. It was no longer a debate. It had become something larger, something that belonged not only to the people in the hall, but to every voice, listening around the world. Sundar stood steady at the podium, his shoulders relaxed yet unyielding. The folded letter rested beside his hand like a symbol of every struggle he had survived, every doubt he had overcome. His voice, when it returned, was calm but carried a gravity that pulled the room closer. India's future, he said slowly, cannot be written by leaders alone. It will not be decided in speeches or summits, nor only in the halls of power. It will be written in homes, in schools, in villages, in crowded cities, in the quiet sacrifices of mothers, in the resilience of children who refuse to stop dreaming, in the kindness of strangers who lift one another even when they themselves are broken. If we are willing to see that truth, then the answer to your question is yes. India can rise. His words settled like a gentle storm, quiet yet irresistible. The hall was utterly still, as though even the chandeliers above were listening. Then, he spoke of the youth of India. Millions of young people, their eyes bright with dreams, their hearts hungry for possibility. He described how they carried smartphones into villages that once had none, how they built ideas in small rooms that would one day touch the world, how they carried not only ambition, but hope. They are not waiting for permission, he said, softly. They are building the future already. And our role is not to doubt them, but to believe in them, to clear the path where we can, and to let them walk where we cannot. He spoke of families, fathers who carried burdens quietly, mothers who worked 2 jobs yet still told bedtime stories, siblings who shared everything because there was so little to share. He reminded the hall that resilience is not an abstract ideal but a lived reality in these lives every single day. If they can endure, Sundar said, then so can a nation. If they can rise, then so can India. The audience shifted, many with softened expressions, some wiping their eyes, others caught in the quiet realization that they were witnessing something far beyond a corporate leader's speech. And then Sundar's tone shifted again, his voice growing firmer, steadier, as though he was not only speaking to Tulsi but to the world itself. We must stop believing that progress is built only through power, wealth, or force. True progress comes from respect for one another, for our differences, for the dignity of every life. Humility keeps us from arrogance, resilience keeps us from despair, and kindness binds it all together. Without it, there is no future worth building. The words cut through the air like light through shadow. Tulsi's expression had changed now, no longer sharp, but thoughtful, as though the challenge had touched something within her. She leaned back in her chair, her silence not of resistance but of acknowledgement.